very much, Mr. Jon Bisset, for joining us more than that show. Let's begin with the overview of the Community Radio in Association of Australia. Could you please share with us the mission and an objective of the association?
Sure. We're the peak organisation for community radio and community television broadcasters in Australia. We've been around nearly 50 years. We have our 50th anniversary next year. And our mission is to help community broadcasters to be stronger and more successful. So very simple mission, and a vision that community radio broadcasters or community radio and television broadcasters will be at the heart of every community. So, you know, we play a very important role with community radio and television in Australia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bisset. As a chief executive, you possess the unique understanding into the community radio in Australia. Can you share some light on the challenges faced by community radio stations across the country?
Sure. Community broadcasters are, our country is a very diverse country. As probably in South Africa, we have very remote areas. We have a lot of different nationalities, a lot of different multicultural people across the country. We have huge challenges around our First Nations communities and our particularly our First Nations media organisations who are also our members. So look, our challenges are every time you ask a community radio or television station what their number one challenge is, and they'll always say money. It's always the challenge to get enough money, enough finance to run a really, really successful organisation, to keep your studios on air, to keep the technology working, to modernise, as is probably happening around the world. And in South Africa, there's a greater need. We are broadcasting on AM or FM and DAB plus in Australia, but more and more stations obviously have to be on the internet. They have to have on-demand audio. They're making podcasts and all those sort of things. So a lot of cost involved. I think
overcoming those challenges is critical for community radio sector growth. How do community radio stations negate this obstacle? What support systems are in place to assist those stations?
Yeah, look, in Australia, we're very lucky. We have 40 million Australian dollars of government funding that comes into community radio and television broadcasters. Half of that, about 20 million, goes to First Nations broadcasters, and the other 20 million goes to all of the other broadcasters that exist. For example, in Australia, the community broadcasting sector represents faith-based broadcasters like Christian broadcasters, or we have a Muslim station as well. Multicultural broadcasters across the country in either particularly in multiple languages. For example, the Sydney station broadcasts in about 110 different languages every week. And then specialist music broadcasters, regional and rural broadcasters. So that funding goes a long way, but stations still have to generate most of their revenue. So for an average station, they get about 10 to 20% of their revenue from the government, and 80 to 90% they need to generate themselves. So that's a real challenge. Some do it extremely well and are very advanced in their fundraising or their sponsorship. Community broadcasters in Australia can't have advertising, but they can have sponsorship, and it's to some degree very similar to each other, but you have to have sponsorship instead of advertising. So that's one of the challenges, and how they're sort of working about it. How do we help? And how does, there's a lot of training involved. We provide a lot of training, or our sister organisation, the Community Media Training Organisation, provides lots of training to community broadcasters across the country. We help them with a whole lot of things. And, you know, I mentioned finance as one of the biggest challenges, but really I think the other really big challenge is just around the capability of the people and the workforce to actually have the skills and the knowledge and the experience and the systems to actually deliver on what they do. So it's a lot of work needing to be done around the workforce, training people up, making sure they're paid if they're paid the right amount of money, making sure our volunteers, which are the majority of people within community radio stations, about 17,000 Australians participate as a volunteer in community broadcasting, making sure they have the right skills to do what they do, as well as the paid staff, of which there's just under 1,000 paid staff in Australia, ensuring that they also have the skills to look after their responsibilities.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Bisset. The media landscape has indeed evolved rapidly in recent years. How do you see community radio embracing these changes and seizing new opportunities?
Look, I think the media industry is changing very quickly, and there is lots of opportunities. I mentioned our vision right at the beginning to be the heart of every community, and I think what we're encouraging all of our member stations to do is really become part of the communities they exist in, whether that's a geographic community or a faith-based community or a multicultural community, whatever their community is to be part of it, because that's really where the opportunity is to be the voice of their communities and to be part of what happens every day in their community. So if they're in a country area, a country town, they're talking to the various groups in that town, whether it might be the local government or it could be the police or it could be the local community group or the church group or whatever the community group is. They're talking to those groups all the time and part of them. That is a real opportunity in Australia, where mainstream media is becoming much less involved in those sort of community organisations. So we sort of say that localism and community is the future of community broadcasting, and it's obvious, really, given it's in the name, but it's a really important thing to note.
Now, take us through the community role in connecting the local communities, and could you elaborate more on the impact the community radio station on the communities that they serve, the impact that community radio is having on the community that they serve?
Look, community radio is, as I've said a couple of times, community radio, we want to be the heart of every community. And if we look at some of that local news and information, we have community radio stations now in Australia that are really providing the only news about a particular local community. Sure, you can listen to our national broadcaster, the ABC, telling you what's happening Australia nationally or what's happening internationally, but you can't listen to them and hear about what's happening in the local community. So we are really seeing community radio stations, particularly, beginning to be that local news source in their local communities. Some are beginning to publish, become publishers as well. For example, Outback Radio, which is in a town called Burke, pretty much in the middle of the desert in Australia. I think 2,000 kilometres away from Sydney, has recently acquired the local newspaper. So now they're publishing the local newspaper as well as publishing the local radio news. So that's an amazing sort of story of localism and the role that community broadcasters and radio stations can play in local news and information. I think there's also been some fantastic examples during COVID, for example, or other natural disasters. We had a whole series of bushfires a few years ago, and then COVID more recently, where community broadcasters have really been the local voice around those emergencies. Again, on a station in a town called Braidwood, which is a little tiny country town, was able to really connect with their audiences as bushfires approached that town a few years ago and nearly burnt the entire town down. But they were able to give very specific emergency information around their town and where the dangers were, which for a much bigger broadcaster, a commercial broadcaster or our national broadcaster, they can't be so specific. They've got to talk about a whole 1,000-kilometre square region, whereas community broadcasters can talk about what's happening in that actual town. So some really great, opportunities and stories around how community radio stations can help. Other examples through COVID where, some of our multicultural broadcasters were the ones that were communicating the public health messages, the only ones communicating the public health messages in language that they understood. Same with our First Nations communities, the only ones broadcasting in languages that our First Nations communities talked, could understand, or wanted to engage with.
That's very interesting to hear, and that is one of the most questions that I always like to ask various countries like Canada. I was talking to Mr. Ruke from Canada about the same question. But to take us through the rise of a digital platform, and I believe undoubtedly has changed the media consumption pattern. How do you find community radio stations remain relevant and attracted to audience in this digital age?
I'd firstly go back to my comment about community. It's the most important thing is the content. So if you're providing content that audiences are interested in, that's your most important thing. And then secondly, we have a principle out here that we want to help. This is for the CBAA, my organisation, wants to help community radio stations be able to be heard in any place that their audience wants to listen to them. So at the moment, for many, many years, for 50 years, community radio has been on AM, FM, or more recently DAB+. But we're now helping them also ensure that they're streaming on the internet. Their content is available on demand on the internet, so people can listen to a particular program when they want to listen to it, where they want to listen to it, and helping them with podcasts. So last year, a little over 12 months ago, we launched Community Radio Plus, which is a mobile phone app or an app that's available on Apple products and Android products that provides the streams of every community radio station in Australia. So 350 or so stations are available on Community Radio Plus. We've also helped our stations with the technology they need to have quality streaming. So we provide streaming services at reduced rates. We provide products that they can ensure that they can have on-demand content, so that records their programs and then is available on demand. We help stations with their websites. And I think the most important thing is that's all well and good, but if a community radio station doesn't tell their audiences where they can be listened to, then their audience doesn't know where they are. So we're also helping stations promote the app, promote their own websites. We're helping stations develop their own websites and those sort of things. So, I talked earlier about that capability and the volunteers and staff not necessarily having the skills. This is an area where they don't necessarily have the skills and knowledge, and we're helping them to ensure that their radio stations can be on the internet, can be on the app, and can be found wherever their audiences want to listen to it, whether that's the internet or whether that's on AM, FM, or more recently DAB+.
That is fantastic. I'm so interested to hear what the CBAA is doing for community radio sector in Australia. Now let's take the representation and inclusivity are essential aspect of community radio. How do community radio stations ensure diverse voices are heard, and why it is this important, Mr. Bisset?
Community radio in Australia, as I said earlier, has been around for 50 years, and we have a huge diversity of stations on air. What we're trying to do now is, even within those stations, ensure that they're more inclusive and diverse, so that you don't just have multicultural Australians on multicultural stations or First Nations Australians on First Nation stations. So we have, as many stations as possible in our country that are all inclusive and diverse. So there's a lot of work going on by stations in that area. But I think, what's been really critical in Australia is the role that CBAA and others play in building relationships with government and ensuring government, our federal government particularly, really understand the benefits and support that community broadcasters and community radio stations can have. So, just a few weeks ago, our Australian Minister for Communications, Michelle Rowland, in one of her speeches said how community radio really embodies the whole principle of diversity and how we're really leading the way in diversity in this country, diversity in media in this country. So now that doesn't mean we've done everything perfectly. I think, like many other countries, we have more work to be done and a lot of work to be done around ensuring an inclusive environment and ensuring that anyone can have their voice heard. But I think the most important thing is we are in legislation to ensure that we exist, that there are multicultural and First Nations and Christian music programs, LGBTI plus stations on air.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for that. It's so fascinating that the Australia has 50 years of a community radio sector. Now, let's look at the engagement of community, which I believe is critical for community radio success. How do you, community radio station, foster active participating from their listeners?
Good question. Could you ask that again? I sort of missed the second half of it. Sorry.
I was just saying that the community engagement is crucial for community radio success. And how do community radio foster active participation from their listeners?
A lot of community radio stations by their very nature, and to some degree by our legislation, required to engage with the community. They need to represent their communities. They need to understand their local communities. So, every community radio station in Australia is given when they get a license, they have a community interest. And that community interest might be a Christian community interest, it might be a First Nations one, it might be a particular region. But they have a responsibility under the legislation to engage with that community, to know what that community looks like. For example, if you're the broadcaster, have a license for a particular country town, our regulator will ask, do you understand what the demographics of that country town are? Do you know that there's an increase of Sudanese population because of they've come across as refugees? Do you know that there's an increase in the Sudanese speaking population in your particular area, for example, or it might be the Sri Lankan community, or it might be the Indian community. So they're expected to understand that, and consider whether they should be providing programming for that part of the community as well. And that applies to, some broadcasters have a youth license, so they need to engage with the youth community. Some have a specialist music license. Well, they have to understand the types of music that their audience want to listen to and want to hear. So it's really part, I suppose what I'm saying is it's part of the legislation and part of the requirement.
Okay. Community radio support for local artists and musicians is commendable. Could you elaborate on the ways community radio stations contribute to the growth of the creative sector in Australia?
Yeah, I mentioned a few times, for example, the specialist music broadcasters. So I think they're a really good example of how they can, a lot of those music broadcasters are really important players in the Australian music industry. Our stations, most of our stations, there's some exemptions for multicultural stations, but most of our stations are required to play at least 25% Australian music if they're playing music of all the music they play. That's really important. And we have some stations, for example, there's a station called FBI in Sydney that plays over 50% Australian music. And they also have a policy to play at least half of that 50% being Sydney music, and the other half being more broad Australian music. There's a station in Brisbane, 4ZZZ in Brisbane that plays a certain percentage of female music, or music from female or gender non-conforming artists. And then, of course, there's First Nations broadcasters who are really important in the way they depict, Australian culture or First Nations culture across the country. So this year, the Australian government launched the Australian Cultural Policy, and community radio is a really core part of that policy, which was very exciting for us. So obviously there's music, but there's other forms of support that community radio stations give to, say, local artists or local art galleries and all of those sorts of things. So a very important role in the creative industries.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. A community radio station undoubtedly influential within the community. Could you share some notable success stories or impact initiatives taken by community radio that have a positive influence their community?
Yeah, look, I mentioned some of the emergency ones before, but I think there's lots of examples like that. And I think, you look at some of our music stations around the country, while I'm sort of talking about music stations that play really important roles, giving new artists a name and an opportunity, or they might be running little concerts with those artists and broadcasting those concerts. So we've had a few, we've supported quite a few stations over the last couple of years after COVID, where, musicians had a really, really hard time because they couldn't perform, where we've helped them to help the community radio station put artists, live acts on and artists on, to give those artists a bit more profile, get them some money because they've been paid to do that, and broadcast some more content. So some great stories around that. We have some really amazing programming coming out of particularly all stations, but some country stations where they're doing some really great work in their community. I'm thinking of, a station in Broken Hill, which is in sort of outback Australia, that is doing some fantastic LGBTIQA plus type programming in their community when no one else is doing that. So I think, some great examples across the content of very particular content helping their communities, stations working with local community groups to address community problems, all those sorts of things.
Okay. Thank you very much. The ongoing global pandemic has been challenging for everyone. Has the community radio played a role in providing information support and comfort to local community during the difficult times in Australia?
Yeah, look, community radio station played an incredible role during COVID. From in some places being the only broadcasters that people were listening to, because they were providing local information. To some stations, we had one station I know of that decided not to talk about the news, not to do anything, that was just there to be a place where someone could escape from the lockdowns and just listen to music or listen to fantastic content without hearing COVID, COVID, COVID every 5 minutes. So different different stations did it in different ways. Certainly, government in Australia began to understand the very specific role that community radio stations can do, engaging with communities that spoke a language other than English. We have large communities in this country from all sorts of backgrounds, whether they're across Asia, Africa, the Americas, anywhere that don't speak necessarily English as a first language. And we played a really important role through our ethnic broadcasters in ensuring that COVID messaging and information got out to those communities. So I think that was really important. Clearly, COVID was a struggle for stations, and some stations are still getting back to normal. Before COVID, we used to have 24,000 volunteers in the sector. After COVID, we now have 17,000. So, it has had a profound impact on community radio in this country.
Yeah, that I can agree more with you, Mr. Looking into a future, what do you envisage for the growth and sustainability for community radio in Australia?
Look, I think we have a very bright future, but we can't be complacent. We have to, as I said earlier, find new ways to make money for our stations. We have to keep the government happy with what we're doing while still holding them to account. We need to ensure that we train our workforce so that they paid and volunteer workers can actually, make those stations stronger and more successful. We need to focus on news and information because that's the real opportunity. Local news and information is a real opportunity. We need to focus on emergency broadcasting, another real opportunity. And we need to help stations with the technology that they can't do themselves. So I think they're the really important things. There's lots of other important things, but they're the really important things we need to do over the next 10 years to ensure that community radio stations stay relevant, stay on air, and have a growing audience. I'm not sure I mentioned the audience, but at the moment, about a quarter of the Australian population listen to community radio every week. We'd like to see that grow, and I think that's really important.
Okay. Lastly, is there any particular message you would like to share with the aspiring broadcaster and those interested in getting involved in community?
Look, it's such a fantastic community radio right across the globe is such an important thing to be involved in. I really encourage everyone to get involved with their local community radio station or their peak body and really support the growth of the sector across the world because mainstream media is not going to do it. They're not going to keep everyone informed with the information they need. So community radio has a really, really important role to play. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much. And we are so intent, and then we would like to thank you very much for your shared information with us from Australia. But I just want to share with you what we are currently trying to put together in South Africa. And next year, South Africa will have a 30 years celebration of existence of community radio. Now, through this program, we are planning to have 2 community radio stations sharing information and then raising funds for community radio. I don't know whether maybe Mr. Bisset, would you actually be interested in sharing a participation on that subject? I wish I might send you some information just to see how can we do something. What I would love to call it a twinning program. You know, you have a radio station in South Africa and then in Australia where maybe we have 5 listeners on the podium and then 5 listeners on the podium from South Africa, and then they share their ideas in terms of the community radio, the involvement of community radio in each country, and then maybe there will be some points, winning the points and all of that. So that is the idea that I'm still putting together. I was intending to launch it on the 11th of December. You know, the reason is that the first constitution of South Africa, which was signed by the late Mr. Nelson Mandela, it was on the 10th of December, but now this year the 10th it falls on Sunday, so we thought that we must do it on Monday on the 11th. So I would love maybe to share with you the idea and then maybe to see how can we collaborate on doing
Yeah, very love to see your ideas and have some further discussions about them. That'd be great.
Thank you very much, sir. And pass my greetings to
I will do that, and you likewise to South Africa.
Thank you. But also you must invite me to the AGM again. I want to be there so that I can get a first hand of how things are.
Yeah, we will do that, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.